Thank you, Bob. That was really outstanding. We'll have Bob back after the other two speakers speak and have our question period. It's now my pleasure to introduce to you a new hero of mine. John Theon was the senior climate scientist at NASA. He was James Hansen's immediate boss, and he has recently come out openly in the public and described Mr. Hansen as an embarrassment to NASA. I think Mr. Hansen is an embarrassment to mankind, but that's just me. So it's a pleasure for me to introduce to you John Theon.
Let me begin by saying that I am really humbled and awed to share the same podium with some of the speakers we've heard in this conference. My background is, of course, meteorology, and I worked as the head of the NASA Weather and Climate Program, which included up to 300 scientists in NASA, in academia, and in the private sector. So Jim Hansen was a fairly small part of our total program, and he obviously, in my way of thinking, didn't receive the attention from me that he should have. But I also have to add the caveat that Jim Hansen had, even when I came on the scene, some very powerful political friends. Al Gore was a senator at that time and subsequently became the Vice President of the United States. Now, there isn't too much that a NASA person can do when he's up against that kind of a challenge. But I'm going to talk about my journey from being unconvinced that we even had global warming back in the very early days to more recently, perhaps the early 90s, when I realized that this whole thing is a great big fraud. By that time, I was just about at the end of my career, and I've been quiet about it because I thought, well, I'm over the hill. Nobody cares what I think anyway. However, recent developments have convinced me that it is my duty to speak out and to help educate the public about what we're going to get into if we don't stop this nonsense. In my recollection, the entire issue of anthropogenic climate change had its beginning in the International Geophysical Year of 1958, for it was then that continuous observations of climate dioxide were initiated from the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. As the time series of observations continued, the increasing concentration of this greenhouse gas in the atmosphere became apparent. I recall that while I was taking graduate courses part-time toward my doctorate, then at the University of Maryland, a conference was held on this subject to discuss the implications of this trend. Professor Helmut Landsberg, the meteorology department chairman, summarized the conference at the end of it by saying that if the trend continued, he believed that the climate would warm, although he was very confident that mankind would be able to adapt to the changing climate just as we had in the past. There was no hint of alarmism or prediction of catastrophe in his remarks. By the mid-1970s, despite the fact that although the observed carbon dioxide concentration continued to rise, the so-called global temperature, if there is such a thing, had been declining since the mid-1940s. It became fashionable for some scientists to claim that the Earth was entering a new ice age. Aerosols created by, and I quote, smokestack industries, slash and burn agricultural practices, and every step human beings take kicks dust into the atmosphere. We're blamed for this. Of course, the media promoted the alarmism, just as it does today. It was about that time that Professor Bert Bolin of Sweden proposed that perhaps enough carbon dioxide in the atmosphere might offset this cooling trend. Some scientists even proposed spreading carbon black on the ice sheets and glaciers to absorb more solar energy to aid in preventing the coming disaster. That's how bad it got. One of the earliest alarmists who still believes that climate change is caused by mankind is, of course, Dr. James Hansen of NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies. In 1988, then Senator Albert Gore Jr. invited Dr. Hansen to testify before a congressional committee concerning his climate research. Dr. Hansen stated that global warming is here now, if that's my paraphrasing, and we have to do something about it. At that time, I was working at NASA headquarters. Between the years 1982 and 1994, I was responsible for all of NASA's weather and climate research programs, except those dealing with the stratosphere. Dr. Hansen's revelation came as a surprise and embarrassment to me and my superiors at NASA headquarters, as the official NASA position at that time was climate change. On climate change was that we did not know enough to understand the climate system, and more research was needed. The official policy was that NASA did not and does not muzzle its scientists. In his more than 1,000 speeches, interviews, publications, and public appearances since 1998, it is difficult for me to believe that Dr. Hansen has ever been muzzled. For some time, global warming was not completely obvious to everyone at that time, including me, because thermometer observations did not agree with satellite observations. As time went on, it became evident that the Earth's climate was indeed going a small warming trend as it emerged from the Little Ice Age. At first, I tended to accept that since carbon dioxide was a greenhouse gas, it was driving the climate. And some very well-respected scientists were convinced that mankind's burning of fossil fuels accounted for the rise in carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. Estimates of a global carbon dioxide budget tended to confirm that opinion. This was a stretch because global air-sea exchanges of carbon dioxide are poorly known, and for that matter, even the exchanges with the biota of the Earth. Many researchers had assumed that since the last ice age, the Earth's climate was somehow balanced in a delicate, steady state, and as though the climate never changes, which is absurd. This alone should have sounded alarm bells for those who fail to read history, forget that even as recently as a millennium ago, a Viking settlement had flourished in Greenland for nearly 3 centuries. Despite the fact that worldwide thermometer observations of temperature are a relatively recent development on a time scale of written history, thermometer data are far from perfect. They are point measurements, and they can be manipulated. Of course, satellite temperature measurements are volumetric measurements. They not only measure a great horizontal distance, but a vertical distance as well. And in fact, they cover the Earth much better than thermometers do. They have limitations of their own, however. And proxy derivatives of historical temperatures and carbon dioxide concentrations derived from ice cores and historical temperatures from lake sediments or tree ring growth are certainly useful, but they involve certain assumptions and must have their limitations as well. It is also a fact that any data can be improperly analyzed or manipulated, either intentionally or not. My acceptance of anthropogenic global warming began to crumble when in the early 1990s, a brilliant young scientist by the name of Professor Graham Stevens of Colorado State University came to my office and showed me the results of an investigation he had conducted using the community climate model at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. Professor Stevens had inserted several different cloud parameterization schemes developed by a modeling group in the UK into the NCAR climate model. Now, these schemes are developed based on what these individual climate modelers thought was their best estimate of how the model would form clouds, how effective they would be in terms of persistence and radiative characteristics, and so on. At any rate, when Stevens ran these models, he came out with predictions over the time period of several decades, ranging from 2 degrees of cooling to plus 5 degrees of warming. Right away, that convinced me that the improper modeling was really a disaster. The Earth's radiation budget, I think, is dominated by cloud cover, and poorly simulated clouds and climate models produce nothing of value in the way of prediction. Professor Stevens' experiment confirmed that we did not know enough about the radiative effects of clouds nor how to simulate them in climate models. And they made at that time CloudSat, which does for the first time give us information about the optical properties of clouds and their occurrence and persistence, a mission of top priority in my mind. I worked hard to win approval for CloudSat, although bureaucratic indecision delayed its launch for nearly a decade. It's up there working now, and I think providing unprecedented information about clouds. It is a fact that the world's oceans store vast amounts of dissolved carbon dioxide. So much of the increase of carbon dioxide concentration we are witnessing could be from the release of the carbon dioxide out of solution from the warming surface layers of the ocean. This exchange is going on all the time, and we heard some very interesting new papers on how that's done from geochemists. It is a physical fact that gases dissolved in the sea are released when the temperature of the water rises. And likewise, they're dissolved when the seawater gets colder. We haven't even begun to study the effect of how rainfall might be dissolving carbon dioxide as it falls onto the surface or into the sea. And that's another problem that no one has addressed. The role of solar activity in warming the climate cannot be ignored, nor can the long-term cyclic coupling of the atmosphere and oceans. And we've heard a lot about that in these last 2 days. But I am convinced that mankind, by releasing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and by changing land use, plays a very, very minor role in climate change compared to nature. In the end, I believe that it is largely the reflection of solar energy back to space by global variations and cloudiness that helps dominate the climate change, not CO2. The causes of the variations in global cloudiness are somewhat speculative, but carbon dioxide concentration doesn't affect cloudiness as far as I know. Of course, climate models also fail to simulate other or even include other small-scale or slowly acting subgrid processes very well, making model predictions anything but realistic. Too many modelers, as I found out by talking with Jim Hansen, tune their models. When he would show me a historic record of temperature measurement globally and then show me his model comparisons, they look perfect. Of course, if you have the answer before you begin, you can play with the model until you get what you want. At any rate, this is supposed to make model predictions credible, and it does anything but. As the belief that computer models can forecast the Earth's climate even a season from today, much less decades or even centuries into the future, appears to me a display of hubris of the first magnitude. None of the climate models predicted the leveling off and cooling of the atmosphere that has occurred in the last 10 years. This cooling has taken place even though the carbon dioxide concentration has continued to rise slightly. Increasing carbon dioxide are a fact, but a beneficial one that promotes plant growth, including crop yields. So more carbon dioxide is actually beneficial to mankind. Climate models appear far too sensitive to the greenhouse effectiveness of carbon dioxide, and water as a vapor is the dominant greenhouse gas. As a liquid, cloud droplets are effective in reflecting solar energy, and as snow and ice cover, water again plays an important role because it also reflects incoming solar radiation. In conclusion, our understanding of how climate system works is still rudimentary, clearly not reliable enough to serve as a basis for government policy making. Policies that rely on climate model predictions call for reductions in carbon dioxide emissions, and that is what the models are calling for. Such policies will cost us billions, if not trillions of dollars, will have little, if any, effect on the carbon dioxide concentration or on global climate change. Government policy should be focused on energy conservation and developing new energy sources that will reduce the free world's dependence on imported energy, especially the United States. It should be doing that. The climate system is very complex, one in which small-scale or slow-acting processes that act for a very long time can make a huge difference in the outcome. To believe that important climate processes, some of which occur on a molecular scale, can be realistically represented in a climate model requires a huge leap of faith. Only religion requires faith of its believers. Science cannot be based on faith. It must be based on facts alone. Thank you.